Denna sat at the base of the greystone and put her back against it. Then she brought her harp out of its case and pulled it close to her chest, causing her dress to gather and expose a scandalous amount of leg. She arched an eyebrow at me and smirked as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. "Nice harp," I said casually. She snorted indelicately. I sat where I was, sprawling comfortably on the long, cool grass. I tugged a few strands of it out of the ground and idly began to twist them together into a braid. Honestly, I was nervous. While we had spent a great deal of time together over the last month, I'd never heard Denna play anything of her own creation. We had sung together, and I knew she had a voice like honey on warm bread. I knew her fingers were sure and she had a musician's timing, but writing a song isn't the same as playing one. What if hers wasn't any good? What would I say? Denna spread her fingers to the strings, and my worries faded to the background. I've always found something powerfully erotic about the way a woman puts her hands to a harp. She began a rolling gliss down the strings from high to low. The sound of it was like hammers on bells, like water over stones, like birdsong through the air. She stopped and tuned a string, plucked, tuned. She struck a sharp chord, a hard chord, a lingering chord, then turned to look at me, flexing her fingers nervously. "Are you ready?" "You're incredible," I said. I saw her flush a little, then brush her hair back to hide her reaction. "Fool, I haven't played you anything yet." "You're incredible all the same." "Hush." She struck a hard chord and let it fade into a quiet melody. As it rose and fell, she spoke the introduction to her song. I was surprised at such a traditional opening. Surprised but pleased. Old ways are best. "Gather round and listen well, for I've a tale of tragedy to tell. I sing of subtle shadow spread across a land, and of the man who turned his hand toward a purpose few could bear. Fair Lanre, stripped of wife, of life, of pride, still never from his purpose swayed, who fought the tide, and fell, and was betrayed." At first it was her voice that caught my breath. Then it was the music. But before 10 lines had passed her lips, I was stunned for different reasons. She sang the story of Mir Tyrinnial's fall, of Lanre's betrayal. It was the story I had heard from Scarpi in Tarbin. But Denna's version was different. In her song, Lanre was painted in tragic tones, a hero wrongly used. Selitos's words were cruel and biting. Mir Tyrinnial, a warren that was better for the purifying fire. Lanre was no traitor but a fallen hero. So much depends upon where you stop a story, and hers ended when Lanre was cursed by Selitos. It was the perfect ending for a tragedy. In her story, Lanre was wronged, misunderstood. Selitos was a tyrant, an insane monster who tore out his own eye in fury at Lanre's clever trickery. It was dreadfully, painfully wrong. Despite this, it had the first glimmers of beauty to it. The chords well chosen, the rhyme subtle and strong. The song was very fresh, and there were rough patches aplenty, but I could feel the shape of it. I saw what it could become. It would turn men's minds. They would sing it for 100 years. You've probably heard it, in fact, most folk have. She ended up calling it the Song of 7 Sorrows. Yes, Denna composed it, and I was the first person to hear it played entire. As the last notes faded in the air, Denna lowered her hands, unwilling to meet my eye. I sat, still and silent on the grass. For this to make sense, you need to understand something every musician knows. Singing a new song is a nervous thing. More than that, it's terrifying. It's like undressing for the first time in front of a new lover. It's a delicate moment. I needed to say something. A compliment, a comment, a joke, a lie, anything was better than silence. But I couldn't have been more stunned if she had written a hymn praising the Duke of Gibeah. The shock was simply too much for me. I felt as raw as a reused parchment, as if every note of her song had been another flick of a knife, scraping until I was entirely blank and wordless. I looked down numbly at my hands. They still held the half-formed circle of green grass I'd been weaving when the song began. It was a broad, flat plait already beginning to curve into the shape of a ring. Still looking down, I heard the rustle of Denna's skirts as she moved. I needed to say something. I'd already waited too long. There was too much silence in the air. The city's name wasn't Mirinatal, I said without looking up. It was not the worst thing I could have said, but it wasn't the right thing to say. There was a pause. What? Not Mirinatal, I repeated. The city Lanray burned was Mir Terinial. Sorry to tell you that. Changing a name is hard work. It will wreck the meter in a third of your verses. I was surprised at how quiet my voice was, how flat and dead it sounded in my own ears. I heard her draw a surprised breath. You've heard the story before? I looked up at Denna, her expression excited. I nodded, still feeling oddly blank, empty, hollow as a dried gourd. What made you pick this for a song? I asked her. It wasn't the right thing to say either. I can't help but feel that if I'd said the right thing at that moment, everything would have turned out differently, but even now, after years of thinking, I can't imagine what I could have said that might have made things right. Her excitement faded slightly. I found a version of it in an old book when I was doing genealogical research for my patron, she said. Hardly anyone remembers it, so it's perfect for a song. It's not like the world needs another story about Oren Velsiter. I'll never make my mark repeating what other musicians have already hashed over 100 times before. Denna gave me a curious look. I thought I was going to be able to surprise you with something new. I never would have guessed you'd heard of Lanray. I heard it years ago, I said numbly. From an old storyteller in Tarbeen. If I had half your luck. Denna shook her head in dismay. I had to piece it together out of 100 little scraps. She made a conciliatory gesture. Me and my patron, I should say, he's helped. Your patron, I said. I felt a spark of emotion when she mentioned him. Hollow as I was, it was surprising how quickly the bitterness spread through my gut as if someone had kindled a fire inside me. Denna nodded. He fancies himself a bit of an historian, she said. I think he's angling for a court appointment. He wouldn't be the first to ingratiate himself by shining a light on someone's long-lost heroic ancestor. Or maybe he's trying to invent an heroic ancestor for himself. That would explain the research we've been doing in old genealogies. She hesitated for a moment, biting her lips. The truth is, she said as if confessing something, I half suspect the song is for Alvaron himself. Master Ash has implied he's had dealings with the mayor. She gave a mischievous grin. Who knows? Running in the circles you do, you might have already met my patron and not even known it. My mind flickered over the hundreds of nobles and courtiers I'd met in passing over the last month, but it was hard to focus on their faces. The fire in my gut was spreading until my whole chest was full of it. But enough of this, Denna said, waving her hands impatiently. She pushed her harp away and folded her legs to sit cross-legged on the grass. You're teasing me. What do you think of it? I looked down at my hands and idly fingered the flat braid of green grass I'd woven. It was smooth and cool between my fingers. I couldn't remember how I'd planned to join the ends together to form a ring. I know it's got some rough patches, I heard Denna say, her voice brimming with nervous excitement. I'll have to fix that name you mentioned if you're sure it's the right one. The beginning is rough, and the 7th verse is a shambles, I know. I need to expand the battles and his relationship with Lyra. The ending needs tightening, but overall, what do you think? Once she smoothed it out, it would be brilliant. As good a song as my parents might have written. but that just made it worse. My hands were shaking, and I was amazed at how hard it was to make them stop. I looked away from them, up at Denna. Her nervous excitement faded when she saw my face. "You're going to have to rework more than just the name." I tried to keep my voice calm. "Lanray wasn't a hero." She looked at me oddly, as if she couldn't tell if I was making a joke. "What?" "You've got the whole thing wrong," I said. "Lanray was a monster, a traitor. You need to change it." Denna tossed back her head and laughed. When I didn't join her, she cocked her head, puzzled. "You're serious?" I nodded. Denna's face went stiff. Her eyes narrowed and her mouth made a thin line. "You have to be kidding." Her mouth worked silently for a moment, then she shook her head. "It wouldn't make any sense. The whole story falls apart if Lanray isn't a hero." "It's not about what makes a good story," I said. "It's about what's true." "True?" She looked at me incredulously. "This is just some old folk story. None of the places are real. None of the people are real. You might as well get offended at me for coming up with a new verse for Kingkiller." I could feel words rising in my throat, hot as a chimney fire. I swallowed down hard against them. "Some stories are just stories," I agreed, "but not this one. It's not your fault. There's no way you could have—" "Oh, well, thank you," she said bitingly. "I'm so glad this isn't my fault." "Fine," I said sharply. "It is your fault. You should have done more research." "What do you know about the research I did?" she demanded. "You haven't the slightest idea. I've been all over the world digging up pieces of this story." It was the same thing my father had done. He'd started writing a song about Lanray, but his research led him to the Chandrian. He'd spent years chasing down half-forgotten stories and digging up rumors. He wanted his song to tell the truth about them, and they'd killed my entire troop to put an end to it. I looked down at the grass and thought about the secret I had kept for so long. I thought of the smell of blood and burning hair. I thought of rust and blue fire and the broken bodies of my parents. How could I explain something so huge and horrible? Where would I even begin? I could feel the secret deep inside me, huge and heavy as a stone. "In the version of the story I heard," I said, touching the far edge of the secret, "Lanray became one of the Chandrian. You should be careful. Some stories are dangerous." Denna stared at me for a long moment. "The Chandrian?" she said incredulously. Then she laughed. It was not her usual delighted laugh. This was sharp and full of derision. "What kind of a child are you?" I knew exactly how childish it made me sound. I felt myself flush hot with embarrassment, my whole body suddenly prickling with sweat. I opened my mouth to speak, and it felt like cracking open the door of a furnace. "I'm like a child?" I spat. "What do you know about anything, you stupid—" I almost bit off the end of my tongue to keep from shouting the word whore. "You think you know everything, don't you?" she demanded. "You've been to the university, so you think the rest of us are— Quit looking for excuses to be upset and listen to me!" I snapped. The words poured out of me like molten iron. "You're having a snit like a spoilt little girl." "Don't you dare!" She jabbed a finger at me. "Don't talk to me like I'm some sort of witless farm girl. I know things they don't teach at your precious university, secret things. I'm not an idiot." "You're acting like an idiot!" I shouted so loudly the words hurt my throat. "You won't shut up long enough to listen to me! I'm trying to help you!" Denna sat in the center of a chilly silence. Her eyes were hard and flat. "That's what it's all about, isn't it?" she said coldly. Her fingers moved in her hair, every flick of her fingers stiff with irritation. She untied her braids, smoothed them out, then absent-mindedly retied them in a different pattern. You hate it that I won't take your help. You can't stand that I won't let you fix every little thing in my life. Is that it? Well, maybe someone needs to fix your life, I snapped. You made a fair mess of it so far, haven't you? She continued to sit very still, her eyes furious. What makes you think you know anything about my life? I know you're so afraid of anyone getting close that you can't stay in the same bed 4 days in a row, I said, hardly knowing what I was saying anymore. Angry words poured out of me like blood from a wound. I know you live your whole life burning bridges behind you. I know you solve your problems by running. What makes you think your advice is worth one thin sliver of a damn anyway? Denna burst out. Half a year ago, you had 1 foot in the gutter, hair all shaggy and only 3 raggedy shirts. There isn't a noble in 100 miles of Imre that would piss on you if you were on fire. You had to run 1,000 miles to have a chance of a patron. My face burned with shame at her mention of my 3 shirts, and I felt my temper flare hot again. You're right, of course, I said scathingly. You're much better off. I'm sure your patron would be perfectly happy to piss on you. Now we get to the heart of it, she said, throwing her hands up in the air. You don't like my patron because you could get me a better one. You don't like my song because it's different from the one you know. She reached for her harp case, her movement stiff and angry. You're just like all the rest. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to fix me, Denna said crisply, as she put away her harp. You're trying to buy me, to arrange my life. You want to keep me like I'm your pet, like I'm your faithful dog. I'd never think of you as a dog, I said, giving her a bright and brittle smile. A dog knows how to listen. A dog has sense enough not to bite a hand that's trying to help. Our conversation spiraled downward from there. At this point in the story, I'm tempted to lie. To say I spoke these things in an uncontrollable rage, that I was overwhelmed with grief at the memory of my murdered family. I'm tempted to say I tasted plum and nutmeg. Then I would have some excuse. But they were my words. In the end, I was the one who said those things. Only me. Denna responded in kind, hurt and furious and sharp-tongued as myself. We were both proud and angry and filled with the unshakable certainty of youth. We said things we never would have said otherwise, and when we left, we did not leave together.